I'm Dave Koller from the Young Turks, here to present the TYT Nation video of the week. Last week, the winner, presented by Cenk, was Professor Rich. So this week, when I looked at the four nominees, I was trying everything I could do to pick someone other than Professor Rich, but I couldn't do it. Of the four videos, three of them were terrible, and Professor Rich had a great video giving the historical background of how Catholicism was treated in this country over the centuries and calling it Islam, the new Catholicism. So if you want to find out why I didn't like the other videos, you got to just follow me on Twitter at Dave Koller. And in the meanwhile, I present to you the TYT Nation video of the week by Professor Rich called Islam, the New Catholicism.
Hello, I'm Professor Rich, and this is TYT History, where we try to give some historical context to the issues of the day. And what I want to talk about today is the history of anti-Catholicism in the United States. And I just want you to keep in mind the way we're talking about Islam today and all these state legislation targeting Sharia law and Muslims in general. Now, I'm not making any sort of theological comparison between the two religions. In fact, I'm not going to talk about theology at all, so please don't misunderstand what I'm doing here. But I do want you to understand historical attitudes towards Catholicism. Of course, the country was founded by Protestants from Europe, mostly England. And England, like the rest of Europe, was coming out of a period of intense, often violent conflict between Protestants and Catholics. And so there was already kind of a built-in anti-Catholic sentiment. In fact, there had been a major Catholic terrorism event. Now, the plot failed, but this is, of course, the Guy Fawkes event, which of course is referred to in V for Vendetta, and I'm sure many of you know who Guy Fawkes is. But this was often used to explain how violent and terrible the Catholics were at the time. Now, I want to focus today, I'm going to look at three different elections and two different court cases, and then just some general discussion about the anti-Catholic background. Let's start in the 1830s. At this point, anti-Catholicism begins to be a particularly big deal because the Irish are coming over, and the Irish are largely Catholic. Two women, Rebecca Reed and Maria Monk, will publish books that are today largely considered to be complete fiction, but at the time were taken very seriously, about the horrible experiences they had while being in Catholic monasteries. In fact, Reed will claim she was kidnapped and forced into the monastery, where they claim they were regularly forced to have sex with the priests, and there were beatings and all sorts of terrible things. Now, those things did not happen. This is not an accusation, but they were widely believed at the time. In fact, Reed's book led to the burning down of the convent that she claimed had kidnapped her. And in fact, an entire political movement will arise based largely on anti-Catholicism. They're called the Know-Nothings. Actually, they call themselves, ironically, the Native Americans. But today we remember them as the Know-Nothings. And you may remember them from your history classes as an anti-immigrant group. Well, they were, as much as they were anti-immigrant, maybe more, they were anti-Catholic, because immigrant in the 1840s and 50s tended to mean Irish Catholic. In New York City in the 1840s, there's going to be a massive political fight over the funding of schooling. In fact, one of the reasons why public schooling became a priority for this country is because most schooling before public schooling was being done by Catholics. The Catholics had a long tradition of establishing Catholic schools, which we're all familiar with. And so even Protestants, if they wanted their kids to get an education, were sending their kids to Catholic schools. And public schools, in many ways, were an attempt to take education away from Catholics. And in the 1840s, when the government began funding schools, the Catholic churches, who were running their own schools, wanted money to fund their schools. And this became the big political issue in New York and in other parts of the country during this period. In fact, public schools used the King James Bible, which is, of course, a Protestant Bible, and something called the McGuffey Reader in their schools. When the McGuffey Reader was filled with religious parables that Catholics often interpreted, probably correctly, as anti-Catholic. And of course, Catholics who couldn't afford to send their kids to Catholic schools ended up having to send them to public schools. Now, I want to show you now a cartoon from 1875. It's called the American River Ganges. And as you can see, what we see here is a river. It's the Potomac, evidently, because you see the Capitol in the background. And a group of school children sitting there, and they are being attacked by what first appears to be alligators. There was lots of stories in the news from India of alligators crawling out of the river Ganges and eating children, which is terrible, of course. But if you look closely at these alligators, you'll notice they are apparently cardinals or popes. You can tell by the hats that they're wearing. And this is a great portrayal of the way many Protestants viewed Catholics as coming for their children. And what they meant in this case was coming for them in the guise of education and then turning them into Catholics. All this will come to a head eventually in 1922 when Oregon passes a bill called the Oregon Compulsory Education Act. This is backed by the KKK, and it is explicitly an anti-Catholic measure. What it says is that all children must attend public schools. And this is obviously an attempt to keep kids out of Catholic schools. Now, in 1925, the Supreme Court strikes down the Oregon Compulsory Education Act. And so, of course, today we have a robust system of private schools, the majority of which are Catholic, running alongside public schools. But today we think about this battle over public versus private education in completely different terms. For most of American history, it was in reality a religious struggle between Protestants and Catholics, which I think a lot of people don't realize. Also in 1875, the same year as the cartoon I just showed you, a Republican senator named James Blaine will propose an amendment to the Constitution that will actually pass the House and die in the Senate, specifically forbidding that public money going to private education. Now, is this because he was a part of the teachers' unions and a big supporter of public education? Absolutely not. This was because he was anti-Catholic. Blaine is notoriously anti-Catholic, as we'll see in a minute, and he's trying to shut down the Catholic schools. Now, Blaine will run for president in 1884. He's going to run against Grover Cleveland. And days before the election, he will be in an event where a Protestant minister will stand up and call the Democrats a party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Rebellion, of course, being a reference to the Civil War, which had already happened. Rum is closely linked to this idea that immigrants are a bunch of drunks. Particularly the Irish and the German had this reputation, although in reality the Protestants, families have been here for generations, drank just as much as the immigrants. And then, of course, Romanism, which is a reference to the Catholics. Now, the reason why we remember this quote and why it's such a big deal is the Democrats were very clever at using this quote to turn out Catholics in New York City, which swung the election. Grover Cleveland is going to win this election by 0.3%. Including only 1,004 votes in the state of New York, which is the state that gives him the victory. But it goes to show you that in 1884, attacking Catholics was considered a legitimate political tactic, although it did backfire on Blaine. Another election we should look at is 1928. Now, the Democratic Party by this time had been increasingly growing into two completely different things. I'm putting up a series of electoral maps from 1880 until 1924, and then eventually we're going to get to 1928. And I just want you to look down at the southeastern part of the United States. And what you're going to see is it's going to be solid blue during this entire period. These are the old unreconstructed Confederates angry about the Civil War, rejecting the Republican Party. And this is an intensely racist and also an intensely anti-immigrant and increasingly anti-Catholic voting bloc. Now, the rest of the Democratic Party, particularly in the Northeast, were winning elections by doing the exact opposite. They were actually appealing to immigrants and appealing to Catholic voters. And so the Democratic Party is beginning to fracture along these lines. In 1924, in fact, they can't decide on a candidate. The Northern Democrats want a guy named Al Smith, who's a Catholic himself from New York City. Southerners want William McAdoo, who's more of the bigoted Southern politician. They settle on a compromise candidate in 1924 and get killed in the election. In 1928, they'll fight it out. They'll have one of these ideologically charged conventions, and Al Smith will walk away with the nominee. And then here's the 1928 electoral map, and what you'll see is for the first time, really since the South got the vote back after the Civil War, you're going to see southern states defect into the Republican Party. And really, this doesn't happen again until 1964, when Barry Goldwater embraces states' rights, i.e. segregation, in that election. Now, the next election that we need to talk about, of course, is the one you were expecting, 1960, when John F. Kennedy is going to run for president. Now, the knock on Catholics that many Protestants had was that they couldn't be loyal Americans, that they served a foreign master, and what they meant was the Pope. The idea was that Catholics weren't loyal to the United States, that instead they were loyal to the Pope. And therefore, not only was there a question of whether or not a man could be president of the United States and a Catholic, because that would be, in their opinion, being ruled by a foreign leader. But many people said you couldn't be a citizen of the United States and be a Catholic because citizens of the United States are not allowed to give their allegiance to a foreign monarch. But this was the argument at the time. And in 1960, JFK had to go on TV and make a pretty impressive speech. explaining that as president he wouldn't simply do what the Pope told him. Of course, it worked, and John F. Kennedy became president. Now, things have changed a lot since 1960. And in fact, the Republican Party has not only dropped their problem with Catholics, they've tried to embrace them, at least religiously. They've had a difficult time embracing Latin Catholics, but non-Latin Catholics they've actually done quite well with. And this is because the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which the Pope declared immoral, or at least the legalization of abortion, is to be a great sin. And this is, of course, going to create a split among Catholics. Now, the Republicans are very quick to adopt the pro-life side, or the side that opposes abortion. And by 1976, even, in an election the Democrats won, we're going to see a significant bump up in Republican, or Catholics voting Republican. Of course, in 1980, Ronald Reagan will very explicitly invite people who are voting on religious issues into the Republican Party, and he'll do much better than Republicans had before with the Catholic vote. In fact, non-Latino Catholics have become so important to the Republican Party that they've really made a concerted effort to recruit them. Here's an amazing stat, just talking about the change in attitude towards Catholics. Of the first 103 Supreme Court justices, 7 were Catholic. Of the last 10 Supreme Court justices, 6 have been Catholic. And 5 out of those 6 appointed by Republicans. In fact, of the last 10 Supreme Court justices, only 1 has been a Protestant, David Souter. Incidentally, just on an unrelated note, of the first 106 Supreme Court justices, 5 were Jewish. Of the last 6, 3 were Jewish. And of course, today the entire Supreme Court is either Catholic or Jewish, which just goes to show you how quickly and dramatically these things can change. But as we're looking at this, these legislative attempts to try to drive Islam out of our government, I suppose. It's hard for me to understand what they're even trying to do. I just want you to think, whether you're Catholic or not, about the long history in our politics and in our governance of anti-Catholic sentiment. All right, I'm Professor Rich. That was TYT History. Hope you check out some of my other videos. More importantly, I hope you learned something.